Just when you thought it was safe to go back to the inner-tubes, welcome to another session of Sitting with Dr. Lob-EZ. Welcome, friends. Today we're going to talk about Renaissance art. We're going to be talking about many beautiful pieces of artwork. We're going to talk about some architecture as well. So anyway, let's go ahead and dive in, shall we? Picking up here on slide number 11 of our PowerPoint. One of the things that mentioned earlier that we need to make sure that we're aware of is that the Renaissance begins in Florence, Italy. All right. Okay. And so we look here is this is a painting of a medieval artist by the name of Cimabue, who was from Florence, and he was the teacher, pretty much the first Renaissance artist by the name of Giotto, which we'll see. But one of the things that I want to kind of show this painting for is so that you're aware of what medieval features in Renaissance, or how medieval painting is different from Renaissance. If we look at Mary, all right, two things should be noteworthy. She's the largest figure in comparison to everybody else, so that means she's the centerpiece of this painting. We would consider this a Madonna because it's Mary, the Blessed Mother, the Virgin Mother of Jesus. And so the Madonna is usually a painting, portrait, well, not a portrait, but a painting of the Blessed Mother and the infant Jesus. Okay. So she's in the center. She's the largest figure. And she is flanked by angels. And they all have these halos around their head. Those are not astronauts. Those are not like spacesuits that they're wearing. Those are halos to indicate that she and the saints are holy, favored by God. One of the things that you want to look at when you want to notice when you look at these saints, or these are actually angels, not saints, angels, is that they all look the same. Okay, so there is no attempt to make them look different or distinct from one another. Okay, and then let's look at Mary's face. She looks very serious. Okay, little emotion, or she looks solemn. Okay, so that is medieval art. All right, it's Cimabue. Okay, but he's from Florence. All right, now here is the here's an example of Giotto. This is an altarpiece, so this is on wood, painted on wood. So he is kind of seen as the first great, and this is also another Madonna. Not terribly different from Cimabue's. Some of the same types of characteristics are taking place. I'm sorry, I'm in the middle of something. You want some popcorn? Mm-hmm. Okay. Can you make it yourself? Mm-hmm. Okay, baby. All right. Excuse me. That was the beautiful Audrey, Miss Audrey. She's my honey bunny. That's my daughter. For those of you that don't know. Okay. Well, good. There's one left. All right. Okay, so one of the other things that he's known for, he was a big fan of St. Francis of Assisi, and so he painted a lot of pictures. I can't think of anything better to say than pictures. He painted a lot of pictures of, a lot of paintings of St. Francis of Assisi, and he also is known for coming up with a kind of like perfecting the artistic type frescoes. Sorry, I'm struggling here. So we'll talk a little bit about frescoes here. Here. This is the Lamentation. One thing that I want to show you here is if you look very, very closely, you look at the face of Mary, okay, and her face is clearly pained. And if you look at these angels flying around, they're in agony, okay. So that display of emotion is important, okay. That's something that we see in the Renaissance, okay. That adds to that feature of realism, or that sub-theme of realism, but human emotion, okay, and you see it depicted there in the painting, so that's important. But he's also, as I said, frescoes. All right, but the three that excuse me, the three that we want to talk about are Masaccio, Donatello, and Brunelleschi for different reasons. Okay. All right, I'm gonna skip that. Get straight to Masaccio. This is in Santa Maria del Grazia in Florence. It's actually in this church. This is not on the main altar, but a side chapel. We'll talk about in just a second in more depth the design of churches, but typically during the Renaissance, Middle Ages, what have you, the church, from a bird's eye view, from looking at it from high up and looking down upon it, it would be in the shape of a cross. And so there's the main altar, but then also with the cross kind of intersecting them, there'd be two little side chapels, and this is one of the side chapels. So what you see here is a painting depicting Adam and Eve as they've been expelled from the Garden of Eden, and this is the first time that we've seen nudes since the Classical Age. And when we look at the medieval mindset, man was seen as very wicked, and lustful, so they would always make sure that they were covered in clothing. And so this was quite a scandal. Initially, the patron, I believe it was a cardinal from Florence, ordered after Masaccio finished to have somebody come in and cover it with leaves of some sort, so not to appear as profane. So anyway, very interesting piece, and as I said, it appears right up there on the altar, so you can imagine in a church, this would be quite controversial for the time. So most important thing about it, Masaccio, first nude since antiquity, okay? And this is another one that's on there too. It's called Tribute Money. And this is kind of an interesting painting because in the background you see it attempts at perspective, okay, that three-dimensional effect. Giotto experimented with that as well. And one of the other things too, so this is a story of Peter, Jesus, and some of the other apostles being greeted by a tax collector, and then Jesus tells them to pay the tax collector by going and plucking a pearl out of a fish's mouth. And so it's actually, the story is told in like 3 parts. So this is them being greeted by the tax collector, and then Peter's angry, but Jesus is instructing him to go to the water to get the pearl. And so we see, I guess this is like part 2, and then part 3 he's paying it. So anyway, this idea of instructing mankind or Peter to pay the tax collector can be construed as that give unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, okay, and that man has a responsibility that is his duty to follow temporal authority. Like he is morally required to follow the law. Okay, so that's something I've included because that's kind of with religion and stuff, that's going to be a recurring theme, whether or not you have to. Do you have to follow, do you have a right to rebel? And this would be an example of saying, no, you don't. All right, moving on. Donatello. Okay, this is this is David. Yes, this is David, the biblical figure, David. This is the first time since antiquity that we've seen a bronze sculpture, and that it is freestanding. Okay, and it really is a 360-degree piece of art. And depending on where you stand and look at this sculpture, you're going to get yourself a little bit different idea of what's going on. Okay, so you're going to see different things, and so that's one of the beauties of these. And it's different from medieval art, because most medieval art at the time, or excuse me, sculptures, they would be like they would be a, I think they call them like a relief. So they would be sculpted out of a wall. So, you know, there was no opportunity to look all the way around, even behind, to see what was going on. But this is the first freestanding sculpture, bronze since antiquity. So, and also, if we look at the way he's standing, we'll talk more about this because there's another David. This is by Donatello. This one, contrapposto, which shows movement. All right, gives the illusion of movement. All right, and it's kind of hard because my head is covering the head of the dead Goliath. I didn't plan on this, but it looks like David's got his head or his foot on my head, but that's actually the dead Goliath who he has beheaded. But this is a very different depiction of what you get from Michelangelo's interpretation, but this is the first. Okay, so like this is like 1430, I believe. Let's go to the next one. If you look at his face, he's got long hair. He looks kind of adolescent. He, as you would expect in the, from the story in the Bible. But he has a shepherd's hat, and he has what are known as laurel leaves. And laurel leaves throughout history have symbolism. They symbolize wisdom, but they also symbolize courage. Laurel leaves. Okay, and so in this particular instance, that's fitting. But if you look at his face, he does look a bit feminine, as well as his musculature or lack thereof. So certainly sort of an effeminate with the longer hair as well. And so, well, hold on a second. There he is again. Okay, there's the face, or there's the Goliath's head. And, okay, so you're looking at this, and you're like, all right, this is interesting. See what's going on. So he's defeated the mighty Goliath, and if you don't know the story, he was a Philistine, and David was of the Israelites, and he took the mighty Goliath, this giant of a man, scared all the Israelites, but David was too young to really be afraid. He was kind of naive, but he fought him and struck him in the head with a pebble that he slung from his sling. Anyway, here's move my let's move this out of the way because this is a little weird. Okay, so this is the okay. What the heck is this? This is the helmet of Goliath, and he's got like wings on his helmet. All right, he's got feathers, giant feathers on his helmet. And if you look at this, it's riding up the leg and kind of tickling the nether regions of David. This is kind of a bizarre sculpture. Okay, some people, and I don't know, but this is. I'll just give it to you. But there's speculation that Donatello is gay. And I was doing some reading on this. Florence wasn't a very heavily at the time, the 14th century, 14th, 15th century, not heavily populated, and that homosexuality was rampant, or at least homosexual relationships were rampant, and it was kind of an elite thing, customary, and so anyway. This has got some homoerotic overtones in it, to say the least. And it could be that that was because that was kind of culturally more acceptable at that time period. So yeah, this is the David by Donatello. All right, let's go back over here. Whee! All right, Brunelleschi. Brunelleschi is responsible for creating the first dome since antiquity as an architect. He's an artist, but also an architect, and he won a design in Florence to, there was a church called Santa Maria del Fiore, St. Mary of the Flower, and they had a contest for architects to come up with plans to put, like, to cap the church or to build a roof of some sort. And what was typical at the time was to have spires. That's called Gothic architecture, and so I guess the city fathers wanted to deviate away from that, or just have something that was a little bit unique, and so he proposed a dome. And so when we look at domes, the last two domes prior to this, the last one was the like in the 2nd century was the Parthenon in Rome, and then after that the Hagia Sophia, the Holy Wisdom in Constantinople, like in the 6th century. So it's almost been 1,000 years since anyone had been attempted to build a dome, and this is quite a feat, quite an undertaking. So he is able to do that. All right, he succeeds. He gets the contract, or wins the contest, and he sets to it, and it is a impressive engineering and architectural feat, to say the least. And it is it adorns. I mean, it kind of dominates all the other buildings in Florence. So I've seen it firsthand. It is breathtaking. The color, we would call it terracotta. So the church was built, and this is the dome, aka Il Duomo, Italian for the dome. And this is the bell tower, and then that's the baptistry. That's where people would get baptized. But this is 350, 400 feet tall, all told. I mean, I think the dome itself is 100 or almost 200 feet tall, but all combined it's over 400 feet tall. Yeah, this is a prototypical medieval Gothic church with the tall spires. Skip that. Let's go continue going. So those are the first three important Renaissance artists that we need to know something about, or architects. They were kind of the first generation, if you will, and then the masters that we'll talk about: Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo, and then another artist by the name of Titian. A little bit, we'll talk about him and their importance, because there's quite a lot to say about them. We want to look at I guess some of the features of Renaissance art. So I said ideal or realistic was important. They wanted to make sure that people were depicted as they really appeared. There was special interest in doing so. There were some innovations in painting that made that more possible with the advent of oil-based paints, and that is what you can see here with this is a painting by Michelangelo. No, by Leonardo da Vinci, excuse me. And this woman is holding an ermine, similar to like a weasel. They used their fur, their pelts, to make coats out of. And so I'm assuming he did work also with a single-haired brush. Difficult to depict fur without doing that. You usually need a single-haired brush, but oil-based paints allow you to work with different colors, a lot of distinct colors, and so that adds an element of realism. Something else called chiaroscuro, that's shadowing or shading, excuse me, to enhance naturalness, and the obviously perspective. That's super important, and that is, geometrical disappearance. I mean, let's see, what else do we see? The nudes, that's unique. Not always religious subjects, sometimes religious subjects, sometimes the Greeks and the Romans are shown for inspiration. Other times it's just people of the time that they hired an artist to paint them. So it could be a person during that time period. Okay, so we want to talk a little bit about Michelangelo. This is, some believe this is him that's being featured in a painting by Raphael, and he looks pretty deep in thought and perhaps even a little bit annoyed because this is during the time of his life when he was painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. If you know anything about that story, it was a very stressful time for him. He didn't really want to do it, and it was very painstaking. It went very slow, and the project was much bigger than what he really wanted to do. And the patron was Pope Julius II, who was evidently a very difficult person to work for. And he frequently yelled at Michelangelo. He even struck him with his cane. And on another time, he threatened to throw him off of his scaffoldings if he didn't hurry up and finish. So I can understand why Raphael, kind of a contemporary of Michelangelo, would paint him. I think that's kind of humorous. Okay, so he did most of his work in Rome, okay? And a lot of his work can be found in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, in the Vatican, okay? The most important piece he's ever done is the Pietà, and it was his first sculpture. This is a giant piece of marble. So he used different types of chisels to get this. And some things that we want to, I mean, it is incredibly lifelike, and it is quite a piece to behold. I've seen it. It's behind glass, and I'll tell you why in just a moment, but it kind of takes away from it. You can't get, it's an intimate piece. You look at the face of Mary, and what you see is she is, as the mother of the dead Christ, obviously she is grief-stricken, but it's a dignified grief. She is shown in a way to be very respectful to her and the importance that she holds within the Catholic Church. If you look at the wounds here, this is where Jesus was stabbed by the Roman soldier. It looks incredibly lifelike. One of the other things that I wanted to show is her face. Okay, obviously I said there is some, it's a dignified sense of grief, but if you look, she looks extremely young. And when asked about that, Michelangelo's comment was that, well, she is the Blessed Virgin, and according to the Catholic faith, the Catholic religion, she was supposed to have lived without sin, right? In that many believe that people look old because they have sinned. And so the more wrinkly a person appears in old age, it's because they've committed quite a bit of sin. And so even though she would be in her late 40s. She looks to be a teenager, and so that's due to the fact that she lived without sin. The other thing that's important to note here is that she has across her chest a sash, and this was done after the piece was completed, but Michelangelo sculpted his name in that to give himself credit, and so that is something that's kind of noteworthy about Renaissance art, is that frequently we see artists, somehow signing their work to kind of give credit to themselves, and that is a sub-theme of the Renaissance, this idea of individualism and the importance of the individual. During the Middle Ages, artists would never have thought to do something like that, but this is a different time period, and so individualism is important. And the story behind it is that it was giving, people were giving this sits in St. Peter's Basilica, and people were giving another artist credit for it, and he was kind of sore about that, so he came in at night and chiseled his name on it, so everyone knew that it was Michelangelo. And this is his greatest piece, at least from a sculpture standpoint. All right, so this is a picture of what took place in the 1970s. Some lunatic took like a hammer to poor Mary's face and hacked it off, and they had to repair it. And so what they did was take some of the marble. I have no idea how you would do this, but they took some of the marble from behind and were able to repair her face. So now she sits behind a giant piece of glass. So no lunatic can get in there and do the same thing. All right, so this is probably the more notable David. This isn't Michelangelo's interpretation, so this is, 18 feet high, tall rather, quite different from Donatello's David. You see the contrapposto stance, and for those of you that don't know what contrapposto means, it means it's I guess, an optical illusion. It gives the illusion of movement. Contrapposto, all right? And so what we see here with this David is, this is not after the battle. This is just before the fighting has taken place. And so David spots Goliath off in the distance, and although his body looks relaxed, his neck muscles are tensed, his brow is furrowed, and he is readying his sling that's on his shoulder. Excuse me. What he appears to be doing also is transferring his weight from the right to the left, as if like he's getting ready to begin walking towards Goliath. And so that is something you should be familiar with. This is granite, and this was paid for by the Medicis. This is in Florence. I said all his works in Rome. This is in Florence. This is in the what's the name of it? It's a square where the same square where Savonarola was burned at the stake. That's the Piazza della Signoria. And this, along with other statues, was a symbol of the greatness of the city. There's a duplicate, but this one's indoors. It's at a museum. It's quite impressive. One of the things that, so this is the mock, or the fake one, that is still there today at the Piazza della Signoria, or Signoria, I think is how you pronounce it. Anyway, yes, he's nude. Yes, he is heavily muscled. Why do this? Why make a biblical figure? Why make anybody that perfect? So we'll call this ideal, at least in the artist's mind, his mind's eye. This is beautiful. This is the most ideal form of human beauty. There is a bit of Neoplatonism that is associated with that, only something that is pristinely beautiful could be, only those things that could approach the beauty of the eternal. And I know that Neoplatonism, that Neoplatonic ideas are very confusing, but that a lot of people say that in these, especially Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo's work, and Raphael, we see that there's Neoplatonism going on. But anyway, I digress. Let's see what else. His hands are very big, and that, like, out of proportion big. Yeah, he's okay with doing that, because if you go back to the Pietà and you look at it, okay, it's kind of geometrically in the shape of a triangle. Her lap, okay, and her hips, or whatever you want to call it, would have to be enormous for her to be able to hold Jesus like this in her lap. But that gives a sense of symmetry and balance that the Greeks sought in their kind of art and architecture, and so this is kind of inspired by that. But it sort of an illusion, optical illusion, but he's okay with doing that. So even though he's trying to make everything as realistic as possible, proportion isn't, I guess, as important to him, because you see Mary's out of proportion there. But then also David's hands. David's hands are very large, much larger than what they are supposed to be. And the reason they say that is because this is speaking to what the genius of man is capable. Man's genius is capable of creating anything. And the greatest tools that a person possesses are their own two hands, because it's out of that we can create some of the world's greatest inventions. Okay, and remember, this is about progress. No longer are we stuck in the mud. We're, life. Civic humanism is the idea of making the world a better place, and that's why we want to use the Greeks or the Romans for inspiration. Okay, so his greatest, or I guess from a painting standpoint, he does a giant fresco, and he is commissioned by Pope Julius to do it inside of St. Peter's Basilica, which has been ordered, like the church, to be rebuilt. The church has been around since like first or second century AD. St. Peter, where he was crucified. This is where his burial is. The church was built over the burial site. So they wanted to redo it, and so this is all like big part of it. He's asked to paint a chapel, the ceiling of a chapel. And the project was only going to be of the 12 apostles, and then it gets changed. And so he ends up doing quite a bit of the Old Testament. There's like 348 people that are painted, and these are all frescoes. I'll talk a little bit about that in just a second, what a fresco is. But some of the figures are up to 10 feet tall. So he did it, most way up on scaffold, and I've seen it. It's quite impressive. Okay, so there's God creates the world. He creates man, and then from the man's rib, Adam's rib, he creates Eve, and then we see they're kicked out of the Garden of Eden. The temptress Eve forces Adam. Convinces Adam to eat from the fruit from the forbidden tree, the tree of knowledge. It goes through the flood, Noah's flood. There's many scenes that are depicted here. Okay, this is the one that I want to talk about. So a fresco, this is what it looks like from down below. And so a fresco is plaster. Okay, so when you apply the plaster, you have to be skilled at that to make sure it's smooth. And you apply it to the ceiling, and then you have to paint it. And when you paint it, it gets absorbed. The color gets absorbed. And if you make any mistakes, you've got to take it all down again, right? At least that section of plaster, and start all over again. So it's a process that you got to do pretty quickly before the plaster dries. And so, but once it does dry, the color that you put in is absorbed. It becomes permanent. So it's quite a fascinating media to work with. This is you can freeze frame if you want to look, and you can look this up. And these are the actual scenes. These are the people that are in that painting. Let's see, fresco. Okay, yeah. So the one this is the spark of life. Interesting way that he's depicting, God giving Adam life. Their fingers are touching. Again, Neoplatonism here, the beauty of Adam. Some people think this is the vessel that God is traveling in, that it's the brain. Like if you look at a cross section of the brain, it kind of looks like that. Perhaps that the genius of the human brain is divinely inspired. Who knows? But the creation of Adam is probably the most famous, iconic piece of his, painting of his, certainly in the Sistine Chapel. He was also commissioned to create a dome over the top of St. Peter's Basilica. This is the church. And he was commissioned to do that. And so that was his something that he did late in his life. And this was much larger than the one by Brunelleschi in Florence. This is the largest church in the world. This church is enormous. And that dome is enormous. This is the light coming in. It's quite majestic. We'll talk about this briefly, but this was done later. This is a whole different type of art genre. It's called Baroque, but this is the colonnades. This was done, as I said, later, and it looks as if these are hands that are reaching out, inviting people to come into the church. So it's trying to create an inviting feel, because the colonnades envelop the visitor, and so that's sort of purposeful. So we'll talk more about the colonnades when we get to Baroque art. He was commissioned later to come back to kind of finish up, not the ceiling, but the wall, and this is called the Final Judgment. And so this is, Book of Revelations, when the Final Judgment, people, there's another term for it. People will, come up. Bodies are being unearthed. The dead that are righteous. They will go into heaven. Some people are being thrown down into hell. So this is a very emotionally charged scene. And the reason why I mention it, the figures look slightly different than the ceiling. This is in his later years, kind of after the Renaissance is kind of over. It looks as if he's kind of evolving as an artist, and there is a type of artwork that's Baroque, or even something called Mannerism, where you have sort of exaggerated figures in order to kind of convey a specific feeling, if you will. So even in his lifetime, the importance of realism kind of changes. This is a painting of St. Bartholomew, who was skinned alive. He was a martyr who was skinned alive, and he's holding his flayed off skins. a lot of interesting things going on in this painting. But I want to move on to Titian. Just talk a little bit about Titian. He did most of his work in Venice, so that's another important city for the Renaissance. These two guys are very important figures. We'll learn about them. This is Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, and this is Philip II of Spain. So he was kind of like the guy that the very wealthy, the most powerful, commissioned him to do portraits. They would sit for the portraits, and he would paint those. So that's the work of Titian. So that's kind of what he's most known for, and also a little bit of that type of artwork known as mannerism. Talk about Leonardo da Vinci. We have him, and then Raphael, and then we'll be all finished up. Leonardo was a true Renaissance man. There was an artist himself. His name was Vasari, who wrote a book called The Lives of the Artists, and he said a lot of wonderful things about many of the artists of the Renaissance, but he kind of reserved his highest accolades for Leonardo da Vinci. He is seen by many just a man without equal because of his mind and because of all the things that he was involved in, and it's not just art. And so for that, he gets the title Universal Man or Renaissance Man, right? A man who is gifted in so many different things, and so he's glowingly spoken about by Vasari because of those things. One of the things that's really, I think 1965, some of his journals were discovered. 1965, hundreds of pages of his inventions, his drawings, his ideas, his experiments that nobody knew about were uncovered, and these are just, I have some examples. He kind of was interested in the human body, and so he performed over 30 dissections of human cadavers. So he was able to dispel a lot of the teachings of Aristotle and Galen with regard to the human body, but unfortunately he doesn't share his ideas, so we don't really, the world doesn't get to benefit from his dissections, but he learns quite a bit about human anatomy and even physiology too. But he wasn't a true scientist, but he had a scientist's mind, and he had all sorts of different invention ideas and contraptions and things like that. And probably the most famous of which was a flying machine of some sort. He had experimented with a lot of different types of materials and things like that could create like an airfoil prototype for a plane. And this is his drawing of Vitruvian Man, and this is pretty important, I think. And the students have drew this with their sidewalk chalk, talked about some things, but so the square kind of represents the how man is proportional and symmetrical, but also the circle shows that as well. But the idea with the circle is that is a symbol of divinity. Ever since the Greeks and the Romans, they created temples that took the shape of a circle, and the idea of the circle is that it's perfect. It's perfectly round, perfectly smooth. There's no beginning and no end, and so gods are believed to be immortal. And so the idea of divinity is shown here, and so this is God's hand is involved in the creation of man. I think that is worth noting because we'll see it again. This is the Mona Lisa, his most famous painting, portrait. because of a couple of different reasons. So this is an oil-based paint. Her smile, that's the most important thing, the enigmatic smile, right? The mysterious smile, the complex facial features that leave the viewer wondering what exactly is she thinking, but she certainly is thinking something. But then the other thing that he uses is a technique called sfumato, and that is kind of the dark coloration, the smokiness that the background gives. And the eye of the viewer is drawn to it, and it looks mysterious and even a little scary. And so that kind of adds to the allure of this, the Mona Lisa. This is a painting that can be found in Milan inside of a church, and he was not a big fan of the frescoes like Michelangelo was, and so he painted directly onto this church wall, which is kind of I guess a no-no, because then it would be subject to the humidity, I guess, moisture. I guess the fresco would somehow insulate it. I'm not sure, but I know that and the fact that he used he experimented with oil-based paints and some other pigments and stuff like that, and it began to flake off, and it freaked everybody out, and they tried to fix it, and then it messed it up, and then in the late 20th century they did a restoration of it, and so it looks a lot better now. I'm going to slide me over here. This is kind of a recreation of it. I like it just because it shows a little bit better. All right, so there's a lot of things going on here, and I'll be very quick about this when we wrap this up. There's definite perspectives going on. There's definite geometric balance, symmetry. If you look at his 12 apostles, they're in groups of 3, and there's 4 of them. There's 6 on this side, 6 on that side. Jesus is the focal point. And evidently, this is the moment when he says, one of you will betray me. And you get insight into the character, or you get insight into their personalities by their reaction. And the one that I think is the most comical is Peter. Peter is seen clutching a knife here, because later on, when he is arrested, Jesus is arrested right prior to his crucifixion. Peter grabs a sword from a Roman soldier and cuts his ear off, and so this is obviously Peter's got a bit of a temper. So that's how he's choosing to depict him there. And if you look closer, if you know the personalities, there's the personalities of many of the disciples or apostles are revealed in the scriptures. Okay, this is Raphael. He died a young man, only 37 years old, but even in that short life, amount of time, he was able to. He was quite a prolific painter. One of his most famous types of paintings were the Madonnas, the Virgin Mother with baby Jesus, and this here is John the Baptist. And the reason being is because he's depicted wearing animal hide, and that's how Jesus found him as an adult, who was kind of setting the stage for Jesus, talking about the coming of the Messiah. The beauty of these portraits and the wonderful scenery, the perspective, the background should not go unnoticed. This is something called the Betrothal of the Virgin, and this is the kind of for the time period. This is 15 early 1500s. It is a recreation of the marriage of Mary and Joseph, and these are the suitors of Mary. But you see Joseph placing the ring on her finger. I like to note that the temple in the background has a lot of Greek and Roman influences, because you got the columns and the archways. Wonderful display of perspective here. This temple or the structure is round. It's got a dome on the top, So there's all kinds of things that are going on there. So that is noteworthy. This is he was paid by Pope Julius to do a portrait of him. So this is Pope Julius as depicted by Raphael. One of the cooler, the best ones, paintings that he did was the School of Athens. It was kind of a fictitious painting of all these to celebrate all the Greek accomplishments. So it's a number of philosophers, but also mathematicians and would-be scientists that are all collected here. And the focal point is we have Plato pointing to the air because they're having a conversation about truth, and Aristotle is pointing to the ground, saying that the world, truth can be discovered by observing the world around you. And if you're familiar with the allegory of the cave, Plato is saying, no, truth lies beyond our senses' ability to understand or to interpret, that our senses deceive us and that we cannot understand truth with our senses. We have to develop an alternate set of senses. The other thing that is noteworthy about this painting is that Raphael very cleverly put himself in this. So it is a way of him signing it, but he put himself in it. So that's, I guess, a very unique way of doing so. So that does it for the Renaissance and the Renaissance artists. Thank you.